In May 1943, an American general named Andrews and his chief of staff were flying over the southern tip of Iceland. There was thick fog. The plane crashed into a sudden mountain in front of it and crashed. Both Andrews and his chief of staff were killed. In their person died the supreme command of the American armed forces in the European theatre. It happened exactly 8 days before in Washington, at a meeting with the British and American chiefs of staff. Churchill and Roosevelt finally decided that the invasion of northwestern Europe will be from the British Isles, after which the British and American command was to make a plan and make preparations for this operation, which was scheduled for the spring of 1944. The first successors of Andrews and his staff sat in the Pentagon in Washington and familiarized themselves with their inheritance. It appeared before them in the form of mimeographed estimates and directives. They tried on shiny new helmets, armed themselves with automatic revolvers, hung gas masks over their shoulders. They whispered about the secret that had been entrusted to them, and in the cold of spring dawn drove to the airfield, boarded airplanes and flew off to meet the great events. They were listed under the command of the new Commander-in-Chief of the American Armed Forces in the European Theatre, Lieutenant General Jacob L. Devers, and when they arrived in London to fulfill the historic task assigned to them, they were given the nickname Johnny Rookies. Curiously, the man who gave them this nickname was also an American officer. The nickname Johnny Rookies was given to Jackie Devers and his staff by none other than Major General Barker, whose full title read as follows: Deputy Chief of Staff of the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces. To the initiated, this title, if deciphered, spoke of the following fact: one, that Churchill and Roosevelt agreed among themselves to put in time at the head of all British and American armed forces in the European theatre of war a single Supreme Commander-in-Chief. 2. That this Supreme Commander-in-Chief has not yet been appointed. 3. That, pending the making of this highly responsible choice, a staff has been established for the Supreme Commander, and a Chief of Staff has been placed at its head to represent and speak for the Supreme Commander, although the Supreme Commander himself does not yet exist. For that this provisional headquarters, the nucleus of the future organization, would be a joint Anglo-American headquarters built on the principle of parallelism, with the object that both countries should be equally represented in it. In British military terminology, parallelism, for this situation, means that for each position there are two workers, one British. One of them, of course, must be senior, but the principle of parity is restored by alternating seniority in each successive rank. In one there will be an Englishman as chief and an American as deputy. In the next the chief will be an American and the deputy an Englishman, and so on. All this could be deduced with perfect clarity from General Barker's title, and as the American Barker was designated in it as Deputy Chief of Staff, it followed that the Chief of Staff of the Supreme Commander himself must be an Englishman, which coincided with the truth. The Chief of Staff was Lieutenant General Frederick E. Morgan of the British Service. This headquarters was established back in March and was known by the abbreviated name Cossack. By May, Cossack had already drawn up the first version of the invasion plan, and Winston Churchill himself gave it the name Overlord. The Prime Minister throughout the war took a keen interest in the choice of words to cipher a particular operation, and this choice always reflected his personal attitude to it. When intelligence first began to report on the intention of the Germans to launch rocket-propelled aircraft shells, Churchill gave them the name self-shooters, which emphasized the primitiveness, clumsiness, and inaccuracy of these weapons. When the rocket-propelled missiles became a more real threat, their coded designation was changed to bodyline, a term well known to all cricketers and meaning an unauthorized and crude way of playing the game. At one time, the entire British Empire was shocked when Australian cricket teams first started using this technique in international matches, hoping to intimidate English players. Cossack was housed in Norfolk House in St. James's Square, just off Piccadilly, a stone's throw from St. James's Palace. Johnny newbies settled about 1 mile away from them, in Grosvenor Square, in the heart of Mayfair. Grosvenor was a rather pleasant block, less crowded than other London neighbourhoods. Here was the home of the American Embassy, several high-rise buildings in which apartments were rented for a very expensive fee, and a few mansions. There was also a barrage balloon, nicknamed Romeo, which was manned by grey-pantsed air defence girls. In windy weather, Romeo now and then circled and fluttered in the air during the descent or ascent, and looked into the windows of the house number 48, where the American commander-in-chief and his senior staff officers were housed. The Americans from Cossack were by no means newcomers. In our opinion, they even got too comfortable. They were transplanted to the London soil, and they ripened on it in the form of quite local fruits. Each in an American uniform of English cloth, sewn by a London tailor, each with a brilliant knowledge of English military abbreviations, each with a pretty English chauffeur seconded to him, an entrance ticket to nightclubs, his favourite tavern, and a deeply embedded sense of inferiority in relation to his English colleague. The Americans at Cossack were experiencing this sense of inferiority, not only because they were in a foreign land. The fact was that a year earlier, when the Americans came to London, they were from an army that had not yet received its baptism of fire, and had sent them to veterans' headquarters working at home in their own capital city, specifically to enter and melt into that military environment. If the American retained his individuality and remained an American, he did not fulfill his task. He was precisely supposed to dissolve, to assimilate the new style of work, the English style. If he played along with his noble cousins, and those who still sat in Cossack were obviously doing just that, he was only getting better and better at being a poor relation. This process of selecting and assimilating Americans suitable for such a role had been going on in the bowels of Cossack for quite some time. This was the impression its workers made on us when we paid them a visit upon our arrival. I flew to London at the tail end of Jackie Deavers's entourage, a week after the crucial meeting in Washington. We arrived in a party of about 20 men and were dispersed among the various departments in No. 48 Grosvenor Square. I was assigned to the operations department, probably because in America I had learned what little was known about the mixed assault echelon of paratroopers, and also because I had specifically asked to be given an opportunity to study a branch of military science, and not merely to use my civilian experience as a journalist to communicate with the press. In my department there were few people like me, reserve officers and recent plainclothesmen. Once the invasion was finally decided, the European theatre of operations assumed predominant importance, and its command was given the right of preference in the selection of officer personnel. Most of my comrades were therefore from graduates of the military academy, or at any rate career officers. But they had no more experience than I had, and they felt very insecure when they first familiarized themselves with the work ahead of them. This was all the more strange because by this time the American army already had a group of commanders with combat experience, both senior officers and generals, from among those who had planned the invasion of Africa and then carried out that successful operation. But instead of sending these men to London to prepare the main strike, they were left in Africa to prepare and conduct the landing in Sicily, an operation of secondary importance. At the old acquaintances I met in London, the first I met was a journalist who had just arrived and was glad to be on time, for he thought the invasion might begin at any moment. The day after I met him, I made an inspection trip to Bristol to see the American troops there. It was on them that the world had pinned its hopes as the force that would storm the fortress of Europe this summer. It appeared that this formidable army consisted of a corps headquarters, which had its headquarters in Bristol itself, and a single infantry division of 15,000 men stationed in its vicinity. The appearance of the soldiers was as neat, and as peaceful, as the fields over which they marched, accustomed to the hardships of marching in the benign air of a mild English spring. Field trips were rare and few in number, for manoeuvres inevitably trampled crops, and it was not the War Ministry but the Ministry of Agriculture that decided what use should be made of the English soil in this spring of 1943. Experienced soldiers and officers were all in the Mediterranean theatre of operations. It was this front that enjoyed the predominant attention of Washington. We at Jackie Devis's headquarters had nothing in our hands when we got down to business, but a piece of paper with orders to prepare an invasion of the continent as soon as possible, presumably by the spring of 1944. At first, we didn't even have an invasion plan. It was still being finished and finalized at Norfolk House in St. James Square, and there was no way to get it. The only thing we had was an order from the Council of Chiefs of General Staff, but it was too brief and given in too general a form. It was at the first meeting, when we tried to clarify it and work out an organizational chart that would precisely define the powers and duties of each person, that we got the nickname Johnny Rookies. To the gentlemen of Cossack, we were also troublesome and annoying, who threatened to disturb their peace and break the established order with intrusive inquiries as to why this was so and why that was not so, and with too great an abundance of ideas on matters of which we had too little idea. All in good time, we were told all issues are worked out. Plans are drawn up by qualified specialists who know the channel and its shores well, and who know the enemy well. Here will come the time and the plan will begin to be implemented. When that time comes, we will be told, and what will then be required of us. We will also be told. All this was quite reasonable, and there was no denying that we were indeed newcomers, quite ignorant and naive, and yet it was utterly ridiculous. On the one hand, the necessity of a colossal effort to bring about an invasion of Europe. On the other hand, the total unpreparedness of the Allied forces on the territory of the United Kingdom for any effort whatsoever. This unpreparedness was expressed not only in the fact that we had one single infantry division, with which never conducted landing manoeuvres, for in England, apparently, there were no free banks for such an exercise. The roots of this unpreparedness sat deeper, in the inertia and indifference of all those directly or indirectly affected by the affair, from the British generals with their staffs to the civilian organizations in charge of procuring and rationing food, distributing manpower, requisitioning buildings and territorial plots. But when we complained to American officers who had already been in London for a year, they found excuses for everything. What were we to do? To telegraph to Washington, "We are not happy here, we want to go home." And this only a month after we had arrived, washed and primped at this new school. We felt very lonely. It's easy to write about battles. There the enemy is something tangible, his intentions and his forces more or less identifiable. There are their own resources that can be calculated. There is a clear line, there is a plan of action. There is territory that can be mapped and then studied. There was none of this in London in the summer of 1943. So it seemed to us Americans. There was no adversary. There was no disagreement. There was only refined politeness in the higher spheres and complete inaction. And at the same time, the struggle was going on and was becoming sharper and more intense with each passing month. It was played out between the Americans on General Devis's staff and every British official with whom we had to deal. It always revolved around the same question: the nature and pace of preparations for the invasion for which we were ordered to prepare. It was not difficult for us to make a list of everything we were to accomplish. We were to organize an invasion of the north coast of France, a combined assault operation, the base of which would be the south coast of England. The British and Americans were to prepare for it together, cross the English Channel together, and fight together, shoulder to shoulder. What we needed then was the following: agree with our British allies to command the troops that would carry out this operation, to find and have at our disposal a suitable site on which to make final preparations for the American troops, to find and obtain a coastal area suitable for combined landing maneuvers, to develop jointly the technique of such a combined landing operation, and to see that it is simultaneously mastered by both British and American troops. The compilation of the tactical plan was entrusted to the staff of General Morgan, and the American Commander-in-Chief in the European Theatre of Operations had no right to interfere. But in order to carry out all these activities, was it necessary to wait until the plan was finalized? Couldn't it have been done now? Establish on what we would base the main calculation. On the surprise of the attack, or on such overwhelming fire preparation that surprise would no longer play a role? The whole problem of equipping and supplying our landing troops depended on the answer to this question. To establish the scale of the landing, how many troops and what kind of troops will take part in it? In round figures. The point here was not only whether to introduce more or fewer troops into the battle. We had to provide floating means. We had to build landing craft. Building them would require time and the participation of American industry. Without agreement on these basic points, nothing could be moved. The first obstacle in this way was that among the Americans themselves were not unanimous. For this we had no one but ourselves to blame. Lieutenant General Jackie Devers was appointed Commander-in-Chief of American forces in the European Theatre of Operations and sent to England, entrusting him with the task of preparing for the invasion of the American troops there. But the Council of Chiefs of General Staff, in its inexpressible wisdom, had earlier created a joint Anglo-American General Staff, COSIC, with an American Major General as Deputy Chief of Staff, and had also assigned to it the task of preparing for the invasion, namely, to draw up a tactical plan. COSAC drew up the plan, but had no troops to carry it out, no authority, and not even a commander-in-chief. Nevertheless, in the organizational scheme, COSAC was the ultimate authority as the current representative of the future supreme commander. Thus, in London, there were two military organizations engaged in the same business. One had a plan, but no real means of carrying it out. The other, the headquarters of Jackie Devers, had at its disposal the entire armed forces. The other, Jackie Devers's headquarters, had the entire U.S. armed forces, had the authority because it had the U.S. War Department behind it, but had neither a tactical plan nor sufficient prestige because it was not the ultimate authority. Add to that the fact that she had to equip the largest expedition in a foreign country, where she had even less influence than even no one-headed Cossack. At least they had a personal friend of the Prime Minister, the British General Morgan. It turned out that Jackie Devers could give orders to his troops, but he could not move them anywhere without first agreeing on apartments and means of transportation with the hosts of the country where he was a guest. He could not even set up a depot without bargaining a plot of land from someone. In densely populated England, one could not even fire a gun without first making sure that no one was in the line of fire. Whatever Devers undertook, everything was hampered by the cramped conditions on this cosy little island, and these cramped conditions were exacerbated by the war. A complex system of coastal and air defense regulations entangled us like a net, and we had to reckon with the economy of the United Kingdom, with all the civilian economic organizations that fed the population and supplied the army, working under very difficult conditions, often under fire. Thus, while at the top we encountered intangible and abstract obstacles, at the bottom we encountered innumerable quite tangible and concrete difficulties. Such difficulties in wartime are usually solved by the use of emergency powers, created especially for such cases. But we newcomers were required to cope with difficulties without having any authority whatsoever. For every very simple matter, we had first to persuade the English government to issue an order to that effect, even to clear a field, to get a train set, to occupy a house for headquarters. In dealing with all these difficulties, the Johnny Newsmen met with no support from the man who had given them the nickname. The Deputy Chief of Staff, not yet in existence, but the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. Major General Barker was listed as an officer in the American Army, but he was no longer an American. His nationality dissolved into his internationalized position as an Anglo-American staff officer. In theory, Cossack was not subordinate to either the British or the US government, but only to both together. The obstacles that confronted Devers would not have been easy to overcome in either atmosphere. But while he waited for the notorious tactical plan to emerge from the bowels of Cossack, he began to develop the suspicion that it was the atmosphere that was wrong. That was what worried him most. The first failures, let's say, could be explained by objective difficulties. But days passed, weeks passed, but still nothing was done. The English set up committees to help him, But nothing came of these committees but new committees. Committees, 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 they grew like nettles, multiplied like rabbits, and in the end began to divide like amoebas, and the more committees there were, the less useful they were. Meanwhile, it cannot be said that our allies were not capable of anything else. Only an inveterate Anglophobe would say, "We have seen enough facts around to prove that the English can work if they want to." The officers we had to deal with were, as a rule, very intelligent and knowledgeable people, and they had more military experience than we did. They had more experience, and they were working not anywhere but in England. England is a country in which there is order, even in wartime. The English have shown that, for all their adherence to old traditions, they can quickly adapt to a new environment. When England was under the threat of attack from the air, she literally in one day created an air defence. With anti-aircraft defence belts, always on alert with a complex network of radar installations, it was a colossal achievement, both technical and organisational. When fires broke out in London, its fire department in 1 month brought the number of its personnel from a few thousand to 30,000, converted cabs into fire engines and successfully worked with interrupted telephone service and destroyed water supply. England produced the world's finest warplanes and built them under fire in newly evacuated factories. Her Admiralty created an anti-submarine fleet, technically advanced, highly manoeuvrable, highly active. There were other, very recent, evidences of British skill at work. The Anglo-American invasion of Africa was equipped in the British Isles. There was little time to prepare, and yet the invasion began on schedule. And now we were to be in the same England, together with the same British, to prepare a much more important operation. The German army, still undefeated, was waiting for us on the other side of the Channel. German industry was still not destroyed. It was even becoming more powerful as the German boa constrictor digested the industries of those countries it had first crushed and then swallowed. The Allied Navy, for all its might, was having trouble guarding the sea lanes, the lanes through which all American armies were to pass, before they even began to prepare for the outbreak of hostilities. Invasion had become a historical necessity. It was in the air. And so, in response to the call of history, the British engaged in endless talk, and always talk about the difficulties, never about what could be done. Fighting their inertia was like practicing boxing with a sack full of wet manure. It might wobble a little, it might give way under your fist, but you could hardly take your hand away, and the hollow would fill up and everything would be as it was. Only you're the one who got dirty in the mud. The English know how to work in a way that works. The conclusion was equally clear. If it does not work, then they do not want it. Not having lived in London for a month, we had already bumped into trees so many times that we finally realized that we were in a forest. Not just a forest, but an impenetrable thicket. And this impenetrable thicket was the obvious unwillingness of the English to cooperate with us. Soon we could already make a list of all the ways to stick us in the wheels. In general, the recipe was to raise premeditated objections to every measure proposed by us and aimed at speeding up preparations. The English thought out their committee meetings so thoroughly in advance that they had 1,000,000 amendments for every item. And all of them, one by one, had to be withdrawn, otherwise the main thing would be nullified. To turn out against us particularly eloquent officers who could state and develop their points better than the Americans. American career officers, as a rule, are not so skillful in parliamentary procedure and are not so diminished in debating as their English antagonists. Beat us in rank. Our opportunities in this sense were limited. We could only have a certain number of generals, colonels, lieutenant colonels, and so on. It is quite telling that in any negotiation, the American representative was confronted by the senior British officer. If at the first meeting both were equal, then by the second meeting the Englishman was promoted or replaced by another senior officer. Do various manipulations with the agenda. For example, to introduce somewhere at the very end and in the most innocuous form some important issue, on the so much depended. The calculation was based on the fact that the Americans would not have time to study and discuss the agenda before the meeting. Agendas were handed out at the last minute. Sometimes the question was raised at the meeting itself after hours of tedious discussion. In both cases, it was touched on in passing, incidentally, and the minutes of the meeting would record it as a binding, unanimous decision for both sides. This was repeated so often that it became, in American military terminology, standard procedure. Another standard procedure adopted by the British was to try to coddle every newly arrived American officer. For every 100 Americans, there is always a certain percentage who are deeply impressed with English traditions and English customs. Exactly what percentage science has not established, but it can be relied upon, just as, say, a restaurateur can expect that a certain percentage of his customers will like this or that dish. The English have always tried to act with charm first. If things were going well, they pulled the above-treated American into their camp and ensured that in controversial issues he either took a neutral position or, which happened more often, acted as a zealous defender of the English point of view. On the other hand, there is always a certain percentage of Americans who have a keen aversion to the English and all things English. To these there was another technique by which the English almost always succeeded in getting rid of obstinate opponents of their policy. They approached the question head-on, ostensibly with complete sincerity. What to do? They're to reckon with the facts. There are Americans who can't stand the English, and to our great regret, there are Englishmen who can't stand the Americans. But we need to defeat the enemy, and for that we must work together. So let us firmly agree. If we find such an incorrigible hater of Americans, or a hater of the English, then even if he is a very valuable worker, he must be removed. Everyone agrees, and so James, Brown and Sir Cecil are expelled from the Anglo-American staff for the simple and self-evident reason that one hates England and the other hates America. Very good, but this is just the beginning. A precedent has been set, and the British will soon use it. Colonel James Brown is gone, but there is still General so-and-so. General so-and-so is by no means an Anglophobe. He is a connoisseur of English history. His wife collects old Elizabethan utensils and hosts English writers. General Tacoma very much like many English orders, and he speaks with admiration of the character, courage and charm of the English officers with whom he has met. But on purely military questions he strongly disagrees with his English colleague. It is not easy to beat him in an argument, for he is not afraid to stand up for his convictions, and he is a stubborn man what to do with General Takim. The answer is very simple. Contact the highest spheres and say, of course, completely unofficially, such and such is an excellent man. He is invaluable as a military specialist. We all think very highly of him. We even just love him like an old bear. What we did not please him, how it happened, we have no idea. But you see, he can't stand us. Like Sir Cecil, you remember, who we had to send to India because he couldn't stand you? What is there to do? Advise me. In the early days of the war, all the odds were in favor of the U.S. War Department to transfer General Tokogo, something to another theatre of war, where he will not have to come into contact with the British, and he will puzzle in vain over the question of why he was driven here. If there was not enough evidence against General such and such, it could be created. It was possible to involve him in a series of conflicts, to put him as an opponent some Englishman of particularly bad character. And when the general was finally driven to a white heat, it was not difficult to gather facts that spoke eloquently of his prejudice against all Englishmen. It was in this way that one of our most able division commanders was removed from the joint Anglo-American staff in Sicily. Among other objections raised against him was that he has too pronounced a personality and cannot, therefore, be a good staff officer. The real reason, however, was that he proposed a tactic which the American army later did use, but without identifying its author. But when it was first proposed, the British felt that it gave the Americans too prominent a role. A more subtle technique was also used, just the opposite of the one described above. In any Anglo-American committee, there was always at least one pro-American English officer. He would present his views with feeling and with good sense, which were that Americans and the American way of working were the only hope for mankind. His countrymen should learn from us. He listened with deep attention to American proposals, absorbed them and agreed with them, declaring himself a strong supporter of the Americans. He criticized his English colleagues without any hesitation and with great sharpness. If in a committee of which he was a member there was a disagreement between the English and the Americans, he took the floor and with extraordinary skill defended the American point of view, and it was as if he were winning the argument. And yet, still, in the end he had to give up under the pressure of the irresistible logic of his opponent. He would shrug his shoulders and say with chagrin, "What can you do? This time these fools are apparently right." At first, the Americans left such meetings filled with warm feelings for this honest little man, this ardent defender of their interests. They could not understand how it had come about that they had been outbid. Such American-loving British officers usually wore some article of American uniform, also, of course, out of sympathy with us. Lieutenant General Morgan, head of the original Anglo-American staff, at his headquarters always wore an American. It was interesting to watch him argue vehemently with some English general at a committee meeting, and an hour later stroll with him under his arm, chatting amicably. If the British found an American willing to defend their point of view, it was even more convenient for them, because here the goods were genuine. The process of dragging him into the English camp was completed when the British managed to reward him by helping him to get a promotion or some command post that was the object of his dreams. After that, they had a loyal friend ready to fight for them to the last drop of blood. But the most intangible and at the same time the most effective weapon of the British was a technique, which in fact cannot even be called a technique. Perhaps we can define it as their loyalty. The English, generally speaking, are extreme individualists. They have laboured more than any other nation to elevate the rights of the individual over those of the masses. This is reflected in their traditions and in their common law. It is all the more worthy of wonder that in struggle they are able to extinguish their individuality altogether and act as one. When the British state stands up for something or against something, every single person acting as a representative of this state immediately takes his place in the ranks, in accordance with his position and his abilities, and further already with amazing consistency, says and does only what agrees with the general line, completely forgetting any personal feelings and considerations that he may have had before the line was adopted. Such are the English in great things, and such are they in small things. I am reminded of an English officer who was at one time a colleague of mine. For several months he and I laboured, working out a plan for some military operation. We had no disagreement. We lived in the same tent. He was a witty man, and it was fun to work with him. I liked him very much, and he seemed to like me too. We treated each other with complete trust and respect, at least I did. At 5 o'clock in the evening he and I agreed on the arguments in defence of our proposal to be presented tomorrow at a meeting of the General Staff. It was scheduled for 6 o'clock in the morning. He was to speak on our behalf. I was only to accompany him as an assistant. Then we parted, and I never saw him again until the meeting. What was my astonishment? I could not believe my ears. When at the meeting I heard that he was giving up his position on the most important point, the one on which, in our opinion, depended the entire success of the future operation. Officially, I had no right to take the floor at the meeting, but I did, and I was gagged. By the end of the meeting, I could not remember myself from rage, not because my proposal had been rejected, which is all too common in the life of every military man, but because I had been betrayed by a man whom I considered my friend. I called him for a walk and asked him straight out what the hell, really. He replied, without blinking, that he had been persuaded by the arguments put forward by our opponents at the meeting. That was too much. Don't forget that he and I were buddies, and I assumed that I knew his thoughts as well as I knew my own. I told him it wasn't true, that he was lying to me, and I wanted to know why. It was a very hard conversation. Soon his restraint changed, and he confessed that he had received orders the night before to make those concessions, which he did. It was so unexpected and so ridiculous that I said to him, "Look, it is childish to spoil our relations over such nonsense. If you'd told me before the meeting that you'd received an order, I'd have understood. It's happened to all of us. We've all had to obey orders against our convictions. But why pretend to change your mind?" Here my friend became even more embarrassed and said that it seemed necessary to say everything to the end. And he had no right to say anything, for it would violate his code of honor as an English officer. According to that code, he is not only bound to obey an order, even if it be against his convictions, but also to behave in such a way that no one suspects that such an order has been given. He is obliged to pretend that he himself has changed his mind. In Africa, a general, who generally got on well with his English colleague, told me that his colleague's views were so often changed by the orders he received that it was a constant source of amusement to those around him. Everyone could unmistakably detect when he began to speak words that were not his own, but he never agreed to admit it. In London, the Americans did not understand all this at once, and their first reaction was complete confusion and offense. The angriest told all sorts of horror stories about the duplicity, stupidity of the British. But most American officers, as I said, refused to believe such a characterization. It is ridiculous to think, they said, that the English are some kind of monsters of the human race, not like other people. But life in London was not without its pleasantness, and most Americans, not being overly fond of the English, were not alienated by them, made acquaintances and were glad to have an hour or two of rest in a non-military environment. The city itself, even with traces of destruction from shelling and fires, even covered with rubble after countless bombings, nevertheless retained its charm. I had many friends among the English. Some I had met before the war, others when I visited London in 1940 during the Blitz. I saw with my own eyes how they held on when they were hourly threatened with death. I experienced it all together with them and admired them wholeheartedly. In those days, the English behaved like heroes, literally. A year later, I visited England again, returning from a round-the-world trip through China and Russia. The uplift of spirits caused by the bombings had waned. The Londoners were sullen, irritable. This was now my third visit to London during the war, and I saw that its inhabitants had changed again. They had become more silent, argued less, had grown accustomed to everything, and were almost collapsing from fatigue. The work of the war was still going on, but the pace had slowed, and to one who, like us, had just borne its burden, London might have seemed a sleepy realm. In such an atmosphere, it was not difficult for the English government to carry out its policy of sabotage toward the Americans. En masse, the British received the Americans very friendly, with some reservations. As for the troops themselves, everything was provided for in advance. On both sides of the propaganda, leaflets were issued, movies were staged. Every step was regulated by carefully thought-out rules and prohibitions, so that it was difficult to say how relations would have turned out without such unswerving supervision. For example, in order to make Americans welcome in a starving country, each of them was given an extra ration in case someone invited them to breakfast or lunch. The clergy and nobility saw to it that England, in her role as host, did not transgress the sacred. True, it happened sometimes that on the other side of the tea table there were all sorts of whispers and gossip. But the general opinion was that the Americans, though they imagined too much about themselves, but there was no harm from them. They were humble fellows and behaved decently. Ours, for their part, recognized that the British were giving them the utmost hospitality. More could not be demanded in a country where everyone was on limited rations. During my visits to camps in southern England, I sometimes went to the farm next door, and the landlady, an affable old woman, once defined the situation in this way. "We have a lot of people grumbling about your guys, that they have done this and that. But I don't even want to hear anything like that. There are many things that can happen. Still, I'd rather have them than the Germans. But those who immediately established complete harmony were the young people. An American young soldier and an English girl, especially a factory or agricultural worker, to such an extent suited to each other that friendship between them usually erupted like fireworks. An English girl is so brought up that she is accustomed from childhood to look upon the men of her family as beings of the highest order and to honour their slightest wishes as law. American young men could not remember from amazement when they met girls, invariably polite and modest, who did not expect that you for their entertainment will be a waste of money, and, on the contrary, themselves eager to do something nice for you. On the other hand, English girls first met men of whom every man, even the rudest and most uneducated, is accustomed to put the will of a woman above his own, and this in any trifle, for example, what movie to go to or who to carry home heavy packages. Besides, the Americans were astonishingly generous. Martin was easy for them, for they received 10 times as much wages as the English. The American boys and the English girls liked each other very much at once. In the early spring of 1943, it was very pleasant in London. The air raids had stopped. There were still no shell planes in sight. You could go to the theatre or dance with a girl. The bars served beer and even hair-rod scotch if you could show the label you got when you bought your last bottle. You could sleep on a soft bed with clean sheets. And there was the English countryside with its gentle landscape at your side. There was everything the soldier could wish for. There was only one thing missing, not just military action, but any action at all. But the day finally came when Cossack was to hand us the long-awaited plan, the secret plan for the operation we were to carry out, the tactical plan for the invasion of Europe across the Channel called Overlord. Maybe now all our doubts would be dispelled. In July, when the Overlord plan came from Norfolk House to Grosvenor Square, it caused great excitement. The masterpiece, prepared by strategists from Cossack, arrived reprinted, filed in cardboard folders, bound with a braid tied with a bow so that the book would not open. The braid was red in colour. It came in one copy, numbered and certified, addressed to the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Army in the European Theatre of Operations. We received it late in the afternoon and sat over it all night in an inner room, locked up with a key and a sentry posted in front of the door. An inner room with gas lights and maps of the Channel and Europe hidden under the cover of drawn curtains, so that the eye of the uninitiated visitor could not discover them even by accident. They were beautiful maps of the southern coast of England and the coasts of northern France and western Europe. They could have been hung up in Trafalgar Square without any prejudice to military secrecy, for there were no conventional markings on them. They were simply maps of the places where we should land our troops and where they would have to fight when we were told what to do in more definite terms than a general directive. Well, now came the Overlord plan, and we're going to find that out. First, we were to put this plan on the maps, marking it with little red and blue marks in grease pencil on sheets of tracing paper pounded on the maps themselves. In this way it would be seen who and where to go and what and when to do. Thus, the whole of Europe will be in front of us, as if in the palm of our hands. This is where we will kill and where we will be killed. This is where we will meet the enemy and defeat him. First, everything has to be mapped out on this secret map in this secret room. Then, based on that, orders will be given, secret private orders. So little will be divulged in each written order that no one but initiated persons will understand the plan as a whole. Troops will arrive in ships, and they will be moved this way and that. Such and such equipment will be selected for them, they will be trained in this and that, and finally on such and such a day, the troops will come to the shore where these small vessels will be waiting for them. Then they will cross the Channel and land, mystery of mysteries. God is here. First thousands, then hundreds of thousands, and finally millions of men will be put into action. To this great enterprise, which was to emerge like a kind of spirit from under the binding of a book, tied with a red braid, our headquarters was to contribute its share, a microscopic share, which was to help release energy, by the work of thought, by interpreting directives and considerations, by turning them. into definite orders to certain persons. It was the duty of our group to demand from America all that was necessary to carry out the plan, to anticipate obstacles before they arose, to overcome them, and doing all this as staff officers only to advise our commander-in-chief, who already had to decide for himself how to carry out the orders given him by his superiors. We were only replaceable cells of the military brain, just as the gunners who were to carry out the plans we analysed were cells of the military fist striking the enemy. But at least with a plan in front of us, we felt at least like cells. Something real, after the weeks of nothingness we had endured since our arrival in England, what we had been striving for, both men of the civil service and professional soldiers, was the destruction of the armed forces of the enemy at war with our country. Now we had been given the instrument to fulfill that purpose. We were a living part of the whole that would put that instrument into action. We untied the red braid and unfolded the folder containing the Overlord plan. The plan for the invasion of northwestern Europe by an Anglo-American strike army. The moment of rising passed very quickly. The question which the Overlord plan, arriving at Grosvenor Square from St. James's Place, was to answer was this: did it permit General Jacob L. Devers the task of how to carry out the orders given him to invade Europe, or did it not? It was assumed that, having finalized the plan, the Cossack headquarters that had created it would cease to exist until revived as a headquarters under the still unappointed Supreme Commander of Allied forces. Cossack was not an operational headquarters. It was a kind of think tank. Armed with the Cossack plan, the British War Office was to undertake the preparation of the British Army for the battle for Europe. The commander of the European Theatre of Operations had already received orders to prepare the American armed forces. Technically, the British War Office, Admiralty, and Air Ministry, each separately, were to adopt the Overlord plan and prepare the forces at their disposal. As for the Americans, following the American principle of unity of command, all American forces in Europe reported to General Devers. He was to direct the preparation not only of ground forces, but, through the generals and admirals subordinate to him in the European theatre, also the preparation of the American Air Force, and that part of the Navy which was to participate in the operation. The 8th Long-Range Air Force was an exception to this rule, for all strategic bombing, in whatever theatre of operations, was directed centrally by the Chiefs of Staff. However, Ira Iker, who commanded the 8th Air Force, was a friend of Jackie Devers, and in practice all the actions of American forces that summer were centred under Devers' command. Now that Devers had a plan, he could, with even the most rudimentary assistance of the British, proceed directly to the preparation of the operation. But even before the plan was received, there was a suspicion that the problem of preparing for the invasion of Europe carries with it much more than meets the eye. In the light of this suspicion, what did the Overlord plan itself give us? On the face of it, Overlord was a remarkably beautiful thing. It was a volume of 113 pages of statutory format with 10 maps appended. Although probably as many Americans as Englishmen had worked on it, it was written exclusively in the English military language and required a dictionary to translate special terms. But it was not the language of the plan Overlord stumped those who read it for the first time, but the wall of conditions that the authors of the plan surrounded their project. The invasion of Europe, Cossack said, could only be realized if the wind is not too strong, if the tide is just right, if the moon is exactly in the phase required, if the weather prediction for the time when the moon and tide will be just right also turns out to be just right. If all these conditions fail, the invasion is automatically postponed for a month, when the moon should again be in the proper phase, and the of the 12 months of the 4 seasons, generally speaking, only the months of one season are suitable. If the German defences are not improved during this time, between the writing of the plan and its execution, if the Germans by then have no more than 12 mobile reserve divisions in northwestern Europe, and provided that the Germans cannot transfer more than 15 first-class divisions from the Russian front in the first 2 months. And if, during the same time, the number of fighters in the German Air Force is substantially reduced. If all these conditions can be ensured at the same time, the authors of the plan allowed the possibility of its implementation. Reading all these reservations, Johnny Newby came to horror. If the plan were approved as written, it would be easy to create a situation in which it could not be carried out. Indeed, it would not even require open sabotage. One could hardly expect the Germans not to strengthen their defences in the coming year, and who would have believed that Hitler, with large reserves of manpower and under threat of invasion, would not reinforce his armies in France. In either case, however, the invasion was automatically postponed indefinitely. Even if all was well, the departure of the landing fleet was held on the thin thread of an exceptionally favourable weather forecast. Not at any time while the weather is good, but precisely and definitely on such and such a date, if the moon and tide were such and such, and if the wind was not stronger than 9 points. If anyone was going to carry out this plan, or at least insist that it be followed literally, it would look like a bad joke. But jokes aside, the plan itself seemed to us to be a masterpiece of wary, creeping but extremely thorough, conscientious and consistent thought. It lacked brilliance and energy, it lacked any ingenuity, but every step in it was documented. The Overlord plan stood firm, sturdy, sound, and thorough, like John Bull in a friendly caricature. Any attempt to give it a conventional, neutral look would be like trying to make a southern belle out of an elephant by putting a crinoline on it, as someone quite rightly put it. That was the plan. Having considered the coast of Western Europe, the authors of the plan Overlord first excluded all those places where they were sure we could not land for one reason or another. This limited the choice of landing areas to the part of the coast from a point east of Calais to the Cotentin Peninsula on the Channel side inclusive. The authors of the plan then considered the Strait of Pas-de-Calais in the part where it is narrowest, and after diligent reflection decided that it, too, was excluded. The cliffs of Dover are only 18 miles from the shores of the Pas-de-Calais, and for this obvious reason, the Germans have erected there the most formidable fortifications, concentrating their reserves behind them. Thus, the whole Pas-de-Calais area was simply crossed out as too impregnable. Having rejected the convenient shores of Pas-de-Calais, the authors of the plan limited the choice of landing area to the arc of the coast from the mouth of the Seine to the peninsula of Cotentin. And this area was favoured for want of another. It was almost unnecessary to select the landing areas. It was done by itself, because in one place the choice was hindered by such and such a reef, and in another by such and such a rock. The basic premise of the plan Overlord was that after landing on the coast, landing troops will need at least 2 major supply ports to gain a foothold in the conquered positions. But having barely begun to consider this topic, the authors of the plan soon came to the conclusion that it is necessary to abandon the direct assault on the port. Again, because it is too difficult a task. Having thus chosen a desert coast for landing troops, they had then to provide for the capture of vital ports from the land. The choice of one of these ports, Cherbourg, was self-evident, as it is situated at the tip of a peninsula projecting into the strait, a peninsula which could be cut off by a march from the landing areas. The authors of the plan, as we shall see later, left it to history and the land commander to decide whether the second port to fall after the landing would be nearby Le Havre or much farther away Brest. Since once Cherbourg and Le Havre or Brest were taken, the continent was considered open to the main Allied forces engaged in the Battle of Europe. Following the combined air-sea operation, 3 months were given to develop the captured territory, to open ports, repair railroads to receive forces, some of which were to arrive continuously directly from the United States. Air and sea phases of the operation were developed in great detail. In the air, the main task was to provide fighter support for the landings. This support was naturally limited by the amount of time could stay in the air over France. A fighter plane that took off from an airfield in England, and at the same time to keep in the tanks enough fuel to return to the base. Overlord was a conservative plan. Its figures were based on the range of the British Spitfires, even though American aviation had already developed fighters with much greater range. Planners Norfolk House did not bother to discuss this issue with General Iker, the 8th Air Army, which was already fighting at this time over France. And therefore the picture of air cover for the landing from the air looked in the Overlord very disappointing. The scale of the entire operation depended entirely on the availability of landing craft. This was known. The list of world resources showed that the available landing craft of assault types is enough to move only 3 divisions. Another 4 divisions could be transported on larger tonnage ships, from which could be landed only after the coast had been cleared. The authors of the plan made no attempt to overcome this bottleneck or to recommend any measures in this direction. Although the scheduled date for the invasion was still about a year away, the situation of the landing facilities was considered impossible to improve, even though the smallness of the lead landing force jeopardized the success of the entire operation. For the invasion of Sicily, according to the calculations of planners in Africa, required 6 or 7 assault divisions. The assault European fortress, as the authors of the plan Overlord thought, should be limited to the main strike group, no more than 3 divisions. Taking into account all these circumstances, and especially the last 2, Johnny Newby sensed that the plan Overlord not only will not put an end to all the difficulties, but that, on the contrary, now they will only begin. If their partners were unwilling to act, the fate of the invasion seemed to depend on one paragraph of the plan, namely, that paragraph which stated who would command the invasion and which recommended the organization of command and control in Operation Overlord. It was still only July, and by Washington's decision, the invasion was set for the spring of the following year. There was enough time to take over the plan Overlord, to solve the problem of landing craft, to transfer the task of covering the landing sites to the American long-range fighters, and in general to correct the plan so much that the paragraphs with reservations were unnecessary. This task could be accomplished provided it was directed by a man who wanted to do it. All this gave special importance to that part of the plan which dealt with the command and control of the whole operation. We undertook to study this part. The scheme of command proposed by British General Morgan and his Anglo-American staff, in our opinion, very skillfully obscured the question of who would command the invasion. A Supreme Allied Commander-in-Chief was to be appointed, but it was particularly emphasized that he would not be in command. He was to be half a political figure, heading a provisional Anglo-American military power and negotiating, as its head, with the emir governments in England whose forces he was to nominally command and whose countries would soon be liberated by his British and American armies. He himself was not to be a fighting soldier, and he would be given a staff composed not at all of fighting soldiers, but of men capable of manoeuvring in the rarefied air of international diplomacy. Thus, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief would have neither the authority nor the means to command combat operations, and in preparing for invasion he would have to delegate his authority. The real Commander-in-Chief of the armed forces of the provisional military state, thus created, was to be a committee of 3 commanders-in-chief, 1 for land, 1 for sea, and 1 for air. This committee would have such enormous powers that it could easily nullify the activities of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief if it wished. The staff of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief was to become the international headquarters, but each of the 3 commanders-in-chief was free to do whatever he wanted. In addition, each commander-in-chief had the authority to unite Anglo-American forces under his command, if he found it necessary, with the only proviso that on land, an army of one nationality, less than an army corps of 2 divisions of 15,000 soldiers each, could not be under the command of a person of another nationality. Thus, the separate units of 2 navies and 2 air fleets could be completely merged operationally, and 2 separate units of 2 land armies could also be merged, provided they were not split into units of less than a corps. To us, in the light of our London experience, all this meant that if all 3 commanders-in-chief, or even 2 of them, were British, they could interpret the Overlord plan as they saw fit, postpone the invasion as long as they liked or pretend that it was not possible at all. And other, more urgent considerations troubled us. The English arrangement of command and control required the creation of 4 huge headquarters, under the Supreme Commander and under 3 of his commanders instead of 4, which we thought would inevitably entail duplication of work and confusion in the sense of responsibility. The whole structure seemed to us heavy and unnecessarily complicated, and being Americans, we had little faith in the success of harmonization through committees. We preferred that our organs of command be as free as possible from organizational malfunctions. The whole idea of merging forces did not appeal to us. Even putting national pride aside, there remained the fact that by its very idea the merger required in advance a tremendous expenditure of effort in training individuals and in all kinds of organizational links. Almost every stage of military service in the British Army is different from the same stage in the American Army. Everything is done quite differently. Different language, different doctrine, different traditions. The American Army, developed around a small corps of professional officers, was at that time not yet well versed in its business, and meanwhile, if it had been decided to follow the English plan, it would have been necessary to master a different and quite alien military organization, with the consequent loss of time and efficiency. Even the English plan of command recognized that such a merger could only be temporary. Soon the American active army would be several times larger than the British and would require a separate American command. In view of this, the authors of Overlord, clearly contradicting themselves, agreed that in the future British and American ground forces would revert to the command of their respective army groups. The commander-in-chief would then descend from his Olympian heights, at least enough to assign consistent strategic objectives to each of these army groups. When this change should take place, Overlord did not predict. The original committee of the 3 commanders-in-chief remained in force for the duration of the invasion until the outcome of the campaign was finally decided. Presumably, this state of affairs was to last until the defeat of German forces on the Channel coast, or even until the liberation of France. The whole idea of commanding the invasion on the basis of equality of commanders-in-chief angered us. The plan disregarded the first principle of command established by the American president for American forces engaged in World War. The principle of unity of command in any theatre of operations, exercised by a single commander appointed from any one of the 3 branches of the armed forces. The Anglo-American authors of the Overlord plan apparently did not even consider that an army that would one day become 4/5 or 5/6 American should have been given command in accordance with the American principle. Basically, our opinion was that the proposed plan of invasion command, far from solving the problem of our participation in combat operations, only complicated it still further, or at least tended to create complications. In any document, there is always more than it says. The authors of Overlord had the authority to advise only, but that did not prevent them from having their own opinions as well. The opinion of Cossack, and General Morgan made no secret of it, was that, in view of the large scale of American assistance, an American should be appointed supreme commander. The 3 commanders-in-chief should therefore be British. This was all the more convenient, Cossack thought, because the British, having fought for nearly 4 years and having successfully emerged from the ordeal of initial defeat, had a monopoly on commanders worthy of leading such an important operation, which was clearly implicit in the plan. Morgan's arguments were as follows. The dominance of the British fleet in the English Channel is indisputable. In the air, the British have victorious air marshals who defeated the Luftwaffe and won the Battle of Britain. On land there is Bernard Montgomery, the winner at El Alamein, the winner of Rommel and his African Corps, the liberator of Tunisia, and his veteran officers who have done it all with the glorious British 8th Army. Not only were the commanders in place, but, and here General Morgan was even more explicit, the invasion they were to lead was to be launched from the United Kingdom, fed from there and given air cover from there for a considerable time. From all this it followed naturally that the offensive, which depended to that extent on the British Isles, should be commanded by the British. As to the position of Commander-in-Chief of the American forces, which were or were to be in the United Kingdom, General Morgan assured General Devers that his authority would suffer no loss by the assumption of command of his troops by General Montgomery. He, Devers, would retain administrative power, the power to promote and dismiss officers, and he would have jurisdiction over the court-martial. If American troops joined the British Army, the right to try them for disciplinary offences would still remain an exclusively American privilege. The administration of the military medical service was also mentioned. There was nothing more mysterious about COSAC or what it could recommend to the next international conference beyond its tactical plan. If the Overlord plan had been approved as written, there was nothing the Americans could have done to put it into action. Its execution would have depended entirely on men who seemed far more interested in what could not be done than in what could be done. True, an American could be appointed supreme commander, but he was given the role of diplomat and supranationalist. All real power in organizing and directing the invasion, and subsequently the command of the armed forces on the French side of the Channel, was in the hands of the British. If they did not wish to elect 1944, for a postponement, they could always find sufficient reason. The international conference, which was to approve, cancel, revise the Overlord plan, was already scheduled for the month of August in Quebec. With all this in mind, General Devers prepared to present his objections to the conference. Meanwhile, the work of solving even the most urgent problems of preparation for the great invasion had almost altogether come to a standstill, awaiting those basic provisions which would be approved at Quebec. The Johnny newcomers had been in England for more than 2 months. The Englishmen had presented them with an elaborate plan of invasion. They had also shared with them their thoughts on how the invasion should be commanded, but this did nothing to lessen the Americans' suspicion that something still remained unspoken, that there was a sense of some significant reticence in our allies' position. The counterplan, which Devers thought would reveal all this, was a command and control plan as straightforward, simple, and American as the Cossack plan was convoluted, complex, and British. Overlord had already divided the American and British armed forces geographically, placing the British on the left and the Americans on the right. Sailing to France from southwest England, the Americans had the ports of the Irish, through which the American supply lines ran. Devers said only, let each of these rear military districts remain autonomous, each under its own national command. Let the British conduct their training as they pleased. All forces involved in the American operation would be trained by and at the disposal of one American commander-in-chief, all air, land, and sea forces. On the coast of France, Overlord also divided Allied forces between British landing sites on the left and American landing sites on the right. Therefore, Devers said, let the British run the operation as they wished in France. The Americans would simply fight alongside them, under their own unified command. Thus, the command's supply lines and communications would flow uninterrupted from the battlefield to the U.S. War Department. In preparation for the invasion, these lines would run through southwest England. Once ports opened in France, they would run across the Atlantic Ocean from America to France. Devers's plan, of course, also had a supreme commander of the Allied forces, but in addition to the functions assigned to him by the English plan, he was also responsible for assigning consistent objectives to the two autonomous armies, for harmonizing their actions where coordination was required. With autonomy of command, however, the tasks of coordination were to be minimal and concerned mainly with air support. Should one commander face the need to control the concentrated air forces of both nations in some special kind of combat operation? The Commander-in-Chief retained a main headquarters in London where he could keep in close touch with those governments with which he had to deal. But, under Devers's plan, he also retained an operational group of headquarters liaison with the commanders-in-chief of the forces in action. With this simplified command structure, Devers believed it was possible to launch an invasion in the early spring of 1944. In fact, he even thought that, with the necessary tonnage to move troops, he could organize an invasion in the fall of 1943. 2 principles underlay Devers's reasoning. First, the principle of American command for Americans, the principle that Pershing had fought for in the previous war. And second, the simple New England principle that the tighter the fences, the better the neighbors. He felt that the British and Americans would need all their energies to prepare for the fighting and for the fighting itself, and that to complicate all this with the task of merging our forces or working in the complex environment of a joint headquarters would be unnecessary for them. Devers was never known for his tact. He did not hide his attitude to the command structure or to the British reluctance to force the English Channel. On what I think was the only day he was invited to lunch with Winston Churchill, the invasion of Sicily began. The Prime Minister was in high spirits and said condescendingly, as if patting the American commander on the shoulder, "Here is a successful operation, General Devers. This victory will be cheap and it will be a success. That's just what the world needs. Cheap victory." In the evening, when we were told of this conversation, some of us belonging to Devers' staff began to bet that the general would not survive the battle for London. He confessed that he had replied to the Prime Minister as follows: "Forgive me, sir. I think it is nonsense. I think one detachment of soldiers on the coast of France would mean more than 2 armies in Sicily." As an organizer, Devers thought clearly. He had capable generals with whom he could consult. By the time of the Quebec conference, his staff was already well established. Devers was energetic, assertive, persistent, and not afraid to speak his mind. He was at the same time naive, ingenuous, and had no experience, which required his high rank. He was promoted for purely desk work on the organization of the tank corps of the American Army. In addition, he was ambitious. He wanted to take the post of Commander-in-Chief of the American Active Army, which was quite natural but could damage the principled positions that he defended. And he suffered from mental confusion, which is what ruined him. Devers had been in mental confusion even before Quebec, because he could not understand how General Marshall, the man who had created him, who had promoted him to the office he held, the man to whom he feared and to whom he was devoted with all his soul, and whose confidence he suddenly thought he had lost. He did not know, and it tormented him, whether he had lost his trust or not. When this dilemma confronted Devers in June and July, he must have written to Marshall, and they must have been long, earnest, anxious, and toward the end, pleading letters. And to these letters he probably received no answer. Long before Quebec, Devers's staff had pointed out to him the only way out of the situation was to get on an airplane and fly to Washington, and there frankly lay out the situation to the President and his Chief of Staff, lay it all out and ask simply, "What is expected of me?" But Devers could not bring himself to resort to such a simple solution. He agonized over the question for days, and finally decided that he had no right to leave. It would mean that he was abandoning his post. MacArthur, he said, had not come to America from Australia to cry, nor did Eisenhower come from the shores of the Mediterranean. Both, however, had their difficulties. To Marshall, Devers thought, it might have seemed wrong to him to fly to America. It went against the military doctrine they had both been taught. In vain, Devers' staff tried to convince him that MacArthur and Eisenhower had a real war on their hands, while he, Devers, had only a diplomatic war on his hands. He was terrified at the thought of having to face Marshall in a predicament. His unanswered letters were going to affect the outcome of the case. Letters, and at the last minute, certain individuals, like Averell Harriman, whom he had known before the war. He left it to them to defend a case he considered extraordinarily important to the country. When news of the Quebec conference reached us, we learned that General Devers had lost on all points. Churchill met with Roosevelt and Hopkins, and both sides consulted with the chiefs of staff of all 3 branches of the armed forces. The conference decided: 1. Approve the first version of the Overlord plan. 2. To approve the recommended organization of command and control in principle. 3. Direct General Morgan to begin detailed development of the plan and preparations for the operation. Thus, the defeatist Cossack headquarters continued to exist, and work on the Overlord plan was to continue under its instructions. Nearly all the participants in the Quebec conference were unanimous on the question of the shortage of landing craft, and it was recommended that the situation be improved One, by intensifying the transfer of ships stationed in the Mediterranean to the waters of the Channel, and or two, promising the shipbuilding production program by 25%. Whereupon Admiral King ordered his procurers to take immediate steps to study the question of increasing the production of landing craft and watercraft. The British Prime Minister, paying tribute to eloquence, declared that the invasion must be prepared and carried out vigorously and in concert. When his attention was called to the fact that this was hampered by the lack of landing craft, he replied that more landing craft should be produced. The American chiefs of staff limited themselves to simply approving the plan Overlord, but the British chiefs took the opportunity to record 3 reservations. 1. They felt that the conditions necessary for the success of the operation should be insisted upon even more vigorously than in the Overlord plan. 2. They believe that the superiority of the Allied forces is, generally speaking, too slight. 3. They believe that the projected speed of advance is greatly exceeded. Quebec itself, to whom the project had been returned for even more detailed development, made a somewhat surprising statement, since its own plan had been formally endorsed by 2 heads of state. He drew attention to the fact that Operation Overlord might not take place at all, in which case there would be political pressure for some kind of operation on the continent. In view of this situation, Quebec was prepared to compromise the priority of Mediterranean operations and suggested that a small-scale sabotage against Norway, capable of causing newspaper fuss, should be discussed, a proposal which had already been rejected on 2 occasions. In spite of this, and still as supportive of the plan, the conference decided that strategic priority should be given to bomber offensive operations, which were to precede Operation Overlord, and ruled unequivocally that Overlord should be given preference over the Mediterranean theatre of operations in terms of resources. In explaining this latter directive, the conference ordered the return of 7 divisions from Africa to England, of which 3 British and 4 American, with General Devers directed to arrange with General Eisenhower, Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Theatre of Operations, for the transfer of resources. The Mediterranean Theatre of Operations was also to transfer a specified number of landing craft and watercraft. Thus, despite the reservations of the British Chiefs of Staff and the cautions of the men who authored the plan itself, Overlord was approved as a military operation, and despite the very different kind of reservations of the American Commander-in-Chief of the European Theatre of Operations, the British type of command and control structure was approved. So far as I know, General Devers' considerations were not even officially discussed. The only outside comments were those of Harry Hopkins. After confirming the general opinion regarding landing craft, he said, in addition, that he thought that resistance groups in Europe should have been utilized and included in the operational plan. The Quebec conference ended in August. Our fears appear to have been confirmed. The leadership of the invasion of Europe, which was to be carried out mainly by American armed forces, had slipped completely out of American hands, and it was to be assumed that the Americans would no longer be able to control or even influence the course of the affair. For some reason, however, which we could not make out from the reports we read, the conference studiously avoided the question of who would command the invasion. The ranks of the commanders were approved, and the relations between them were specified, but no appointment was approved or even put under discussion. General Morgan remained head of the Supreme Staff, but only as Chief of Staff. General Devers remained Commander-in-Chief of American forces in the European theatre, but without clarification as to whom he was to report to the non-existent Supreme Commander-in-Chief, the American War Department, to which he reported, or the Council of Chiefs of General Staff. In this ambiguous position, with almost no command, the Americans stepped in. Until real commanders-in-chief were appointed under the present Supreme Commander, Devers remained the senior American headquarters in Europe. They could still demand men and supplies from America, could still order their own officers and privates in England. They had a chance to launch an invasion of northwest Europe, a chance they had not had before, for both directives and priorities were now clearer. As for their role, they could achieve decisively everything for their country, and they personally had nothing to lose. This was the last chance for the Johnny New Johnnies, and they took it. It's still 1943, but it's September in England and the days are getting shorter. The Johnny Rookies are now almost veterans of the war being fought in London. The committees are still numberless, the agenda still has no end in sight, but now the Americans are clear about their position, very unclear, unless you consider that they are expected to prepare a whole army for the invasion of Europe. At the top of the list of things to do for the Johnny Newbys was the task of finding a coastal area for training invasion troops. The task, alas, no longer new, for there was not a single mile of coastline in the United Kingdom for us. At last we found one near the village of Appledore. Now we had to equip it for training purposes. It was named the Assault Training Centre. A young engineer colonel, Paul Thompson, had erected there an exact-scale replica of a German fortified area of 1.5 square miles, with concrete pillboxes 6 feet deep. Beyond this area lay a coastal strip of 4 miles where landings from landing craft could be made. The U.S. Navy Department finally swayed and sent us a real live admiral and even the crews of the landing craft that this admiral was to train in troop transportation. As they arrived, the assault divisions were sent to the training centre, sometimes as many as a regiment, to upgrade their combat training there or to be trained at. The only complication was that after we had found a suitable site on the coast, built concrete pillboxes, and provided the course with instructors, we found we had no training program. Nova carefully refrained from giving instructions as to the conduct of the landing operation, what weapons should be used, what formations would take part in it when it would be undertaken, day or night. All these instructions were to come from Cossack, but, faced with the question closely, Cossack was unable to come to any definite decision, and so the American Colonel Paul Thompson and his subordinate 30 to 40 officers received orders from Devers, not to wait for instructions from above, but to act at their own risk, without fear of mistakes, and to pass on their experience at least to the American troops, as into means to accomplish any military objective. Surprise and overwhelming preponderance of force. Sudden attacks succeed best under cover of darkness, overwhelming force in the bright light of day. Thompson and those who worked with him at the Assault Training Centre had to decide whether it was more profitable to sneak ashore at night or to break in broad daylight. The experience of landing on an unfortified coast in Africa had no value in this case. On the shores of the Channel, British commandos, with their faces smeared with black paint, stormed only at night. The plan left no doubt about that. Everything speaks against landing on the shore when the enemy sees you. Guns firing from ship decks will never equal the firepower and accuracy of aim of those on solid ground. The enemy watches you from the shore, sees you from the heights, and you are moving on a smooth shoal. He sits in hiding places, he is hidden from your eyes. His positions are camouflaged, while you are like a fly crawling on the naked belly of a child. He has what are called fields of fire. He has studied the terrain and placed his firing points in those places that dominate all approaches. You, attacking from the sea, have a field of fire only from your floating landing craft, and even then not deeper than the edge of the coast. In addition, the enemy has all the advantages in terms of maneuverability. He can, at will, to regroup troops behind the dunes and on the road network behind the hills. You have no maneuverability at all. Your assault echelons have to move along a narrow fairway through underwater minefields. The landing craft will have to follow one after the other, following the rails. At the moment when you need maximum strength, when your troops landed on the shore, braided wire barriers mined under dagger fire, you will be at a disadvantage. Your soldiers have not yet recovered from the sea voyage. They have no heavy weapons. They have only ammunition to carry on their hands. They have not yet mastered the situation. They act uncoordinated, have not established communication among themselves. But if you send troops in the night landing, the disorder will be even more, and the darkness that should cover you disperse enemy searchlights. The enemy will not have to rely on his own eyesight for crossfire. His guns have long since been aimed at the shoreline, and his soldiers will be required to do nothing more than press the trigger. At night, however, the enemy's minefields and wire fences are even more dangerous. At Norfolk House, they were still busy discussing these problems, and Thompson and the only engineer regiment he had deigned to give him were putting them to the test at Appledore. Already from the beginning, Thompson said, he had come to the conclusion that a night landing was unthinkable. Special recruitment was made into commando teams. The men were individually trained, built scale models of the harbours they were to storm, and practiced on them for months, learning their roles like ballet dancers. A surprise night attack could be mastered by this method, but on the condition of small-scale operations. Thompson was convinced that such a technique is inapplicable to large troop formations, divisions, and corps. The decisive argument was the consideration that even if the commando technique overcomes the coastal defences with few losses, the same fortified firing points will not lose the ability to fire on the subsequent landing echelons, which will arrive at dawn. So it is impossible to start the invasion at night, so we must act during the day. But during the day the enemy will destroy you while you are still on the water. But the operation must be carried out in the daytime, so the enemy must not be allowed to destroy you on the water. Then Thompson reasoned, we'll start with firepower, we'll start with bombardment from ships and planes. We'll add firepower, using all the firepower on all the ships until we're sure it's enough to crush any resistance ashore. We will use the guns of liners, cruisers, gunboats, destroyers, use and field guns, first put on landing craft. We will load entire batteries on barges, and our tanks will begin firing even before disembarking from the decks. Gun to gun, battery to battery. We'll use everything that can shoot. It won't always be accurate, but so what? It'll all hit the shore one way or another. Add to that aerial bombardment. If there is plenty of all of this, soon there will be no point on the shore that can return fire. This is, of course, a crude, simplified statement of the complex technical problem of aerial bombardment and the use of ship and land artillery firepower. But it is fundamentally a reasonable idea, and it was in this way that the American officers of the Assault Training Center came to the conclusion that this task should rely not on the tactics that had been successfully mastered by the commando groups, but on the naked firepower that would rain down on the enemy in merciless daylight from the air and from the sea, from behind an unreliable smoke screen that only partially covered the ships with landing troops and guns. And on the basis of this unauthorized decision, the officers of the training center, without waiting for any sanction, began to train troops in this unauthorized assault doctrine. There was still a debate in high places as to whether the invasion should be launched at day or night, and the Assault Training Center had long ago decided the issue and was training troops in accordance with its decision. Meanwhile, the American headquarters in London was interested in a new weapon, the only new secret weapon of the invasion. It was an amphibious tank DD, which is a conventional tank with a pusher propeller, kept on the water with the help of large canvas crinolines. Its design is of British origin. It was invented by an English officer who was unable to sell his invention to the War Office and presented it to Jackie Devers. Devers gave the drawing to the Chief of Staff Operations, who ordered this new weapon to be tested. The DD tank was to flop from the ship's unloading hatch directly into the water and proceed on its own. During the test, the skipper of the landing barge mixed up the instructions given to him, but the DD still floated. The secret weapon that advanced the tank in the first wave of the invasion was forged. Until now, the defending enemy could have no fear of tanks until infantry landing units forced the coastal fortifications, thus giving the tank units a chance to pass the surf line. The story of the birth of this new weapon is quite revealing in characterizing the difficulties that had to be faced by the headquarters of the American troops. The conversion of conventional tanks into amphibious DD is not difficult, and when the tests yielded positive results, the British War Office agreed to convert a known number of tanks, both for themselves and for the Americans. The task was not so difficult as to appeal to America for authorization and disrupt the production plans of American factories. It was a secret operation on a small scale, and it required only the issuance of orders and mass production. However, in the time that elapsed between the decision to convert the tanks and the date when the first amphibious vehicles were to appear, the British War Office managed in some unfathomable way to forget about their order altogether. It was discovered literally at the very last minute. Such red tape, a normal phenomenon in any army, but the production of tanks is a top-secret weapon, which was to have a major impact on the composition of assault landing units, should not have been left to the mercy of routiners volokichniki. The Johnny Newsmen had no friends before, during, or after the Quebec Conference. In the Mediterranean theatre of operations, Allied troops landed in Sicily in July, but the Quebec Conference reaffirmed that the operation was a diversionary one, and its primary purpose was to put pressure on Italy and remove it from the ranks of the belligerent powers. The Allies by no means wanted to climb up the Italian boot. Now, in the first week of September, the invasion of Sicily had fulfilled the hopes placed in it. The Italian government had capitulated, and Italy was officially out of the war. But this victory by no means freed up American troops and watercraft. On the contrary, as it turned out, the need for both became even more acute there. In the Mediterranean theatre of war, it was decided to pursue the enemy both by land and sea. We had to fight even for those units that we had been promised from this front. And yet in England, in spite of everything, continued to make preparations for the invasion. In one area, at least, we made some progress, namely, the delivery of supplies. It is possible that we had friends after all. For while in the higher spheres of Washington we were treated with indifference, in the not-so-high spheres, namely in the working apparatus of the U.S. War Department, we worked miracles. Everything we asked for was sent to us, as our orders were supplied by the tonnage of naval caravans. That is what has now become the stumbling block. The transport ships, and again the Mediterranean front was guilty of this. Not only was it stingy in giving us what was due us, but, as it became clear at a meeting with representatives of the Naval Command, who occupied the room next door to ours in Grosvenor Square, the increasing demands of the Mediterranean front were depriving us every day, even of the ships that carried our cargoes to England. Supremacy in the European theatre of war was recognized for us only on paper, and all the advantages connected with it were destined for us only for future operations. In the Mediterranean region, hostilities were already underway, and while they were underway, supplies had to be brought there, and the war there dragged on and on. The Commander-in-Chief of the British Armed Forces in Sicily was General Bernard Montgomery. Now his shadow was beginning to fall over the British Isles. One day he and his Army Group headquarters were to be in charge, if only of the British forces. In contrast to this, we in Davos's headquarters set about without much hope to create an American Army Group headquarters which was to command at least two armies, although, according to the plan Overlord, this headquarters was to take command only after the invasion of Europe, and perhaps even after the war was actually won. We were instructed to set up such a headquarters, and we set it up just in case. Davos had evidently not given up hope that he was preparing this headquarters for himself. After the occupation of Sicily, we received a secret cablegram informing us that the American invasion army would be commanded by Omar Bradley. In late September, he himself came to England and first learned of the plan for the invasion of Europe. Having familiarized himself with it, Bradley flew to Washington to discuss with Marshall the extent of his responsibility. The army he was to lead was to be composed mainly of divisions that had fought under his command in the Mediterranean. These were the very divisions which had been decided upon at Quebec and which were now at last beginning to be released. In conferring on the way forward, both Bradley and Davos knew only that Bradley would unite one army under his command. As all of these events unfolded, the most difficult task became even more complicated, continuing to be an unsolved problem. At issue was the floating means of transporting landing troops across the English Channel. It was determined in Quebec that the available landing craft were insufficient to carry out the Overlord plan, and everyone from the President and Prime Minister on down agreed to an immediate 25 increase in total tonnage. But summer was followed by fall, and the numbers, instead of going up, kept dropping and dropping. Representatives of COSAC, the creators of the Overlord plan, noted in Quebec, as for British watercraft, the situation is not clear enough, and recognized a shortage of 870 ships, or 13 of the total tonnage. But when we began to check these figures, it turned out that the shortfall was not 13, but all 55. This was not quite right. In fact, the missing ships were available, but they were in repair all the way from the Thames to Scapa Flow, and they were not there to adjust carburetors. All of these ships were missing essential parts or the entire machinery, and some required complete reassembly of their hulls. The ships continued to dock not only because of these failures, but also because there seemed to be no depots in the whole of England where the missing machinery could be obtained, nor workshops with the necessary equipment and skilled labourers to make them anew. When you went to the British Maritime Ministry for clarification, you were told that the technical staff was entirely at the disposal of the civil authorities. And when you went to the civil authorities, they referred to the Royal Navy, or the Air Force, or the Army. Our headquarters didn't believe those figures at first, didn't believe the situation could be that bad. We went to the docks, inspected the ships, talked to their skippers, to the crews hanging around, to admirals, captains, and chiefs of repair shops. Everything was right. But there was nothing the American headquarters could do about it, for these were British ships of the Royal Navy. That was the position of the British landing craft, which were to carry 3/5 of the total personnel of both armies. And where were those 25 to increase the production of which the U.S. Maritime Ministry was going to take immediate steps? No matter how many cables were sent on the subject, it was all in vain. There was no word about the 20. How is a war won? Donald Nelson, chairman of the War Industries Board, needed a vacation and decided to go to England as a tourist. Second, when Nelson arrived in England, a group of young regular army officers conspired to familiarize him with some figures, and he became so interested in the shortage of landing craft for the coming invasion of Europe that he telephoned the United States and disrupted the order of military production. Nelson put his entire organization on its feet and succeeded in getting the number of landing craft approved under the plan for all of the coming year of 1944 to begin construction in the shipyards, not on a predetermined schedule, but entirely and immediately. Of the landing craft crisis, Donald Nelson exclaimed, "What nonsense! I'll give you as many as you want." But when he was told the story with all the details, told of the fruitless attempts to get any results, he spoke to America on the telephone, not shy in his expressions. It helped. Nelson's orders had had their effect. As a result of this transatlantic telephone conversation held in September 1943, already in early 1944, the program of landing craft production in America was completed 3 months ahead of schedule. After the opening of the Assault Training Center, after Bradley's brief visit, and after Nelson's historic telephone conversation, I left for Washington myself. It was October. My trip had nothing to do with high-level planning, but I had to visit the Pentagon, and since I came from the European Theatre of Operations, I had to come in contact with most of the officers who had to do with it by virtue of their jobs. It was simply amazing how little they knew about what was being done in London. The shortcomings of the Overlord plan should have been obvious to them. The shortage of landing craft was bordering on disaster, but the officers who familiarized themselves with the figures spoke mainly of their futile attempts to improve matters. The U.S. Navy Department fought against the transfer of steel from the construction of warships to the construction of landing craft. The seriousness of the situation, apparently, did not bother officers above the rank of colonel. After all, the British had told them that everything was just fine. For the first week I worked, and then got a few days' leave. When I was free, I called Harry Hopkins and went to see him at the White House. We had known each other before the war, and this gave me an opportunity to talk to him. If I had tried to see the president, it would have embarrassed General Devers. For the War Department might have regarded such a visit as an attempt on the part of the general to bypass Marshall and, taking advantage of the personal connections of a staff officer, to go directly to the head of the entire U.S. Armed Forces. Besides, I had discussed political problems with the president as publisher and editor before the war, and now I did not know who I was myself. I did not want to trouble him with a conversation that would require further investigation. Neither Devers nor anyone else had authorized me to have conversations outside the Pentagon. But I felt that something had to be done, for the matter was too serious. I wanted at least to get it out in the open to one of the people who could do something about it, to get it out and walk away, without asking any questions, without imposing my own considerations. That's what I did with Hopkins. As far as I know, Devers did not learn of our conversation. I put 2 questions to Hopkins. The first concerned the specific situation of the floating landing craft. Where will these vital vessels come from? There is hardly enough time to build them, even if we immediately make changes in the plans of the military industry. Is Hopkins aware of the situation? Hopkins answered in the negative. He was extremely interested. Our conversation dragged on. He was surprised and somewhat skeptical of my words. As I recall, said Hopkins, landing craft have always been a bottleneck, and then he asked me a purely rhetorical question. Why not solve this problem once and for all? To this I had nothing to answer him. I then asked him if he knew that the upcoming invasion still lacked a unified command. The entire burden of this operation will apparently fall on American shoulders. But the American commander in the European theatre of operations does not know to whom he should be responsible for his actions. To the U.S. War Department, the non-existent Supreme Commander, his Chief of Staff, General Morgan, or simply to his own conscience. In this state of affairs, 1,000 obstacles will stand in his way. From an organizational point of view, according to elementary logic, it makes no sense. There is too little time left, and there is still a lot of work to do, if, of course, the performance actually takes place. Such a colossal operation requires a very energetic commander who must take a firm stand and know that the government will support him. Hopkins, first of all, asked me how the Americans in the European theatre of operations feel about the plan, Overlord. Do they hope for success? I replied that in our headquarters consider the difficulties that our allies talk about inflated and exaggerated. Devers and his generals are confident of the feasibility of the invasion. I said that in the opinion of most Americans who have studied the matter, our allies are deliberately complicating matters, and that all their conduct is probably only part of an organized effort to discredit and undermine the very idea of invasion. I explained that I was saying this as a journalist, that I was not authorized to speak on the subject as a military expert or diplomat. We then moved on to other topics, and I took advantage of this to point out to him a possibility for which we should all be prepared. At the next international conference, the British would offer to cede to us the post of Allied Commander-in-Chief, which would be occupied by an American, but in return we would receive the posts of 3 commanders of active forces for the British, and they would be the real masters of the situation. This proposal will look very tempting, but behind it lies 2 pitfalls. The Commander-in-Chief, an American, will be elevated to such a height by the definition of his authority and responsibility that his influence on driving the troops will be very weak. The Commander-in-Chief of the forces in action, the British, will insist that all American troops come under their command, and having achieved this, will spare no pains to mix them with the British troops, which is inexpedient from every point of view. This is not my own speculation. I said to Hopkins, for the head of English war planning, General Morgan himself, had, even before Quebec, spoken quite openly of the manner in which he thought appointments to command posts should be made. I said that, in my opinion, the American army well deserved to fight under its own command, and as the American contingents would many times exceed the British, there was no point, politically or militarily, in forcing them to fight under a foreign command, even if it were to be exercised by the most brilliant commanders. I remember that Hopkins agreed with me on everything. To appoint an American commander of the expeditionary force, of course, should be appointed, but he felt that the most important thing now is coherence of action. Hopkins was clearly thinking of the forthcoming conference at Tehran. Arrangements for it probably already existed. He apparently felt it necessary to delay the appointment until after the conference, even if it would affect preparations for an invasion of the European continent. However, he did not tell me anything about Tehran, but only said that the main problem is Churchill, that in Roosevelt's opinion, we have the right and can act at our own risk. The whole problem is only to find a general who would be able to pull with Churchill. He considered Churchill a man very intractable in military matters and quite capable of commanding his generals. On his own behalf, Hopkins added that the only suitable man was Marshall, but although Roosevelt told him, "You can choose any post you want," Marshall did not seem to want to decide his own fate. He feels that rather than giving him the choice himself, the president should have simply appointed him. In general, on all the issues I raised regarding command and control, Harry Hopkins spoke favourably and put me at ease. He was apparently aware of these matters and insinuated to me that the British, despite their best efforts, would not succeed in the move we foresee. The invasion operations will take place under American command, and the commander will in all probability be General Marshall himself, as he is the only general in the world whom Churchill fears. When Churchill gets carried away with his eloquence, Marshall listens calmly and then brings the conversation down to earth, beating the Prime Minister with facts and figures. Hopkins made it clear to me that once General Marshall received his appointment as Union Commander-in-Chief, things would be different. He would be the actual leader of the invasion, not its nominal head, and would not shift all responsibility to the commanders-in-chief of the active forces. It should not be forgotten that Marshall is an advocate of a unified command, united under America. I returned to England reassured. About Marshall I had the scantiest information. I knew only that he is the master of the American army and that the first campaign made, our army in Africa, was successful. Observers would welcome Marshall's appointment as Union Commander-in-Chief. Of this I was sure, and Marshall himself apparently enjoyed the confidence of President Roosevelt. If Marshall was appointed, the Americans who would serve under his command in the European theatre of operations would no longer feel like exiles and immigrants. In December, 6 weeks later, at Tehran, Eisenhower, not Marshall, was appointed as Allied Commander-in-Chief, and all the troops in the United Kingdom destined for invasion, British and American, were placed under the command of 3 commanders-in-chief. We in London learned of the Tehran conference only by rumour, from officers coming from there. The news that, having familiarized themselves with the plan Overlord, the Russians picked on the same reservations, which embarrassed us, caused in the headquarters almost jubilee. One of these points, with the help of the Russians, will go down in history. When Joseph Stalin read that the entire operation is made dependent on the fact that the Germans in northwestern Europe will have no more than 12 reserve divisions, he seemed to put the papers on the table and said in a very suggestive tone, "Right, well, what if there are 13? It was also said that the Soviet headquarters allegedly insisted on setting dates for the invasion, suggested the 1st of April and agreed to the 1st of May, which date was firmly set. Apparently, Roosevelt had a reliable ally who could help him put pressure on the British to strengthen the whole enterprise. So Stalin was our friend, but on one point he did not support us, trying, apparently, to transfer the invasion plans to the real ground. Namely, on the shores of Normandy, Stalin put forward another Soviet demon. He insisted that Roosevelt and Churchill name the people in charge of the operations and publish these appointments in the press. The world, that is, primarily the Soviet republics, would not believe in the sincerity of the Allies' intentions to invade the European continent until they named the commanders of the invasion operations. He was told that if the world found out about it, the Germans would find out too. I am not at all interested in what the Germans will find out, Stalin replied, and the appointment of commanders became a matter of discussion. Roosevelt and Churchill apparently did not have time to come to a final agreement on this issue. Stalin continued to stand his ground. Then Churchill and Roosevelt, making concessions, decided to meet immediately after the close of the conference, appoint their commanders and announce the appointments in the next 48 hours. They wanted to settle the matter between themselves. Stalin was satisfied, but because of his insistence, the discussion of the appointments to the command posts took place in an atmosphere of haste. In all probability, the candidates were already predetermined. But we in London had the impression that because of this haste, we lost the last opportunity to achieve a unified American command of operations to invade Europe. The British had the upper hand over us. Negotiations began in Tehran. This did not end. It remained to appoint a deputy supreme commander, and this post was taken by an English officer. It was Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, who commanded the British Air Force in Africa and more than once saved British ground troops when Rommel threatened to drive them out of Egypt. Tedder was considered one of the most capable officers in the British Army. He early, beyond his years, was promoted to Air Chief Marshal, was charming in person, energetic, and already had experience working with the Americans. The British also managed to convince the Americans to recall from the post of Commander of the 8th Air, Army friend Diverser General Eicher, replacing him with the Commander of Long-Range Air Forces in the Mediterranean Basin, General Doolittle. Thus, they had a clean slate with the American generals in England. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who as Supreme Commander in the Mediterranean had spent the summer and fall competing with the European theatre, now found himself in charge of it. So the Johnny Newsmen were done with. They were fused to the Mediterranean front, just left Eisenhower, under the command of Field Marshal Sir Harold R. L. L. G. Alexander.